the late 1800s, railroad access brought thousands of European American homesteaders from the eastern United States to the Washington Territory. These settlers sought to govern themselves, and Washington was set on the path to statehood. A new state constitution was created in 1889, and Washington became the 42nd state. But why did Washington settlers wish to create a government of their own? What were their concerns at the time, and how are those issues reflected in the Washington State Constitution?
We were a predominantly agricultural state. The vast majority of Washingtonians either lived on farms or in small rural towns that were servicing the agricultural sector. People on farms had special concerns.
University of Washington law professor Hugh Spitzer is an expert on the Washington State Constitution and its history.
Fundamentally, these were people who were very concerned about the public being able to control their own government. They were concerned about government falling into the hands of big businesses and corporations, particularly the railroads, the grain silo operators, and the people who ran the steamboats on the Columbia River, big mining companies. Basically, the public was very concerned about the legislature falling under the control of these special interest groups rather than being controlled by the voters themselves.
One primary concern Washingtonians had at the time was access to money.
In Washington State, people actually had trouble getting their hands on currency. Fundamentally, farmers were boxed in by a lack of money and by being in debt to the seed companies and the grain silo people.
When Washington farmers were able to get money, much of it had to go to the railroads in order to transport their crops.
Then they had to pay exorbitant rates on the railroads to move their wheat or their hops or whatever else they were growing, to move them to market. And this made people very angry about sort of the monopoly control that the railroads had over their ability to get to market.
The U.S. Congress passed an Enabling Act in 1889, allowing for creation of Washington State. A group of men were sent to Olympia to draft a new state constitution.
The delegates to the state constitutional convention were all men, because at that point in time only men were voting in Washington except for school board. Women got to vote for school board. But the men around the state elected a pool of delegates who came to Olympia, which was the territorial capital, and they met for about 6 weeks in the middle of the summer in 1889, and they wrote a constitution.
What was the purpose of the Washington Constitution?
There are two basic purposes to a constitution. One is to set up the structure of government, and the other one, which is very clear in our state constitution, is to protect individual rights.
While Washington's Declaration of Rights is similar to the U.S. Bill of Rights, there are also many differences.
Our rights protections are much stronger. There are stronger religious freedom provisions and stronger bans on any tie between government and religion. Very strong prohibition of public money being used for religion in any way.
In addition to protecting individual rights, Washington's Constitution also sets up the three branches of state government. One of the fundamental differences with the U.S. Constitution is the way the executive branch functions in Washington State.
In the U.S. government, we elect a president and a vice president, and they're really a team, and then they're in charge of appointing heads of departments.
In Washington State, executive branch power is split among 9 different independently elected officials.
People in 1889 wanted to make sure that power was broken up among a number of different officials to ensure that nobody got too much power. The governor is definitely the leader, but the treasurer is independent, the auditor is independent, even lieutenant governor here is quite independent.
Judges in the judicial branch are also elected independently. Washington's legislative branch has a unique clause limiting bills to a single topic.
The drafters of the Washington State Constitution put a provision in that says that each bill in the legislature has to address only one subject. And that subject has to be reflected in the title of the bill.
The drafters of the state constitution wanted an open legislative process for citizens here in the state.
If you wanted to know what was in a piece of legislation, it helped a lot to have a title at the beginning of the bill that says, "This bill concerns," and it tells you what's in it very briefly, but then you knew that if it concerned grain terminals or working conditions in mines, you knew that you'd better read that bill.
Senator Padden, please state your point of order.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would challenge the scope and object of this amendment.
Limiting a bill to a single topic prevented interested parties from loading up a bill with multiple unrelated subjects.
People were concerned that special interests would go into some legislation that was working its way through the legislature and sneak in things.
Limiting the power of big business was also a priority for the drafters.
There was a suspicion of the railroads, of the grain, the seed and silo companies, and people wanted to make sure that their new state government would control these monopolies. So we actually have provisions in the state constitution banning monopolies.
Washington's constitution is different from all other state constitutions in one key area: education.
Something that makes Washington's constitution really unique in the country is Article 9, the education provision. Article 9, Section 1 says it is the paramount duty, so that's the number one duty. It's the paramount duty of the state to provide for the education of all children residing within its borders without distinction on account of race, color, caste, or sex. That's the 1889 language. It's very special. No other state has that today.
The Washington Constitution is also a dynamic document. It has been changed many times since its creation.
State constitutions tend to be more detailed than the federal constitution. Almost all the state constitutions are. They're easier to amend, and so they've got provisions that come online a little bit more readily than changes in the U.S. Constitution. We pretty much have the same U.S. Constitution that we had in 1789.
An important change to the Washington Constitution came early in its history, with the addition of the initiative and referendum process.
Those came in 1911, and they were as a result of the progressive movement. Again, people concerned about keeping clean government and, very importantly, government in the hands of the people. So when the legislature passes a bill, if you get enough signatures on a petition, that bill is referred to the people for approval or disapproval. Also, with a petition signed by, I think, 8% of the voters, you can put a bill in front of the voters, a piece of legislation that is altogether new.
Though initially drafted to address the concerns of citizens in 1889, the Washington Constitution has adapted over time, evolving to address the concerns of the present.